When Morgan Hale inherited her late uncle's abandoned manufacturing plant, she didn't expect much, just miles of rusted pipework, crumbling beams, and a pile of unpaid property taxes. But beneath the peeling paint and silence, something was waiting. 2 weeks into her attempt to clear out the space, she stepped on a patch of concrete that sounded wrong hollow. And what she discovered beneath that sealed floor wasn't just forgotten machinery or old parts. It was a secret, worth $240 million, and it had been buried for decades. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing this community come together across the map. And if you believe stories like this remind us that the past can still surprise us in the best and worst ways, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode takes things even further. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days by the time Morgan Hale rolled up to the gates of Hale Industrial. What used to be a thriving gearworks plant on the south edge of Milltown now looked more like a war zone of decay. The main gates sagged on their hinges. A sign reading, Hale Manufacturing Est, 1962, hung crooked, one side clinging to a rusted chain, the other flapping in the wind like it was trying to let go. Morgan parked her beat-up F-150 just outside the chain-link fence and killed the engine. The silence was deafening, except for the occasional ping of water dripping from the roof of the old guard shack. She stepped out slowly, tightening her coat around her. The factory loomed in front of her, 200,000 square feet of asbestos warnings, busted-out windows, and vines strangling the brick walls like the building itself was being pulled back into the earth. She hadn't been here since she was 9. Back then, her Uncle Ray had been the only person in her life who didn't treat her like glass. He used to walk her around the factory floor, let her crank levers and bang wrenches against steel like she was one of the crew. He taught her how to tell the difference between 10mm and 12mm by feel. Taught her how to look a man in the eye, how to trust her gut. And then one day, the factory shut down. Just like that. The gates were locked. Ray vanished into silence, and no one ever talked about why. Now, 16 years later, Ray was gone for good, a sudden heart attack. The kind that doesn't give you a second chance. And in a twist no one saw coming, he'd left the factory to Morgan. Not the house. Not the land. Just this place. This broken, useless monument to rust. The lock on the front door was fused shut, so she circled to a side entrance, an old loading bay that had once received thousands of crates a day. She pried the side panel with a crowbar and slipped inside. Her boots echoed against the concrete floor as the air shifted around her, stale and bitter with oil, metal, and mold. Flashlight in hand, Morgan moved slowly, tracing her steps through shadow and silence. The factory floor still had its conveyor tracks, long rusted. Hooks hung from overhead rails like skeletal fingers. One wall still bore the faded safety poster her uncle had made her sign once as a joke. Every day safe is a day earned. The place was a tomb. She paused in the center of the main hall. A cracked skylight let in a sliver of gray light that pooled directly beneath her feet. That's when she noticed it. The sound. When she shifted her weight, something echoed back. Not the solid thud of concrete. This was different, like a low drum. Hollow. She froze. Listened again. There was something under the floor. Something that didn't want to stay hidden. Morgan didn't sleep that night. She sat at the scarred kitchen table of her uncle's small house on the edge of town, with a mug of coffee going cold, the factory's keys scattered like relics between her fingers. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that sound again, the hollow echo beneath the factory floor. She had walked the entire building after that, testing patches of concrete with her heel, tapping pipes, listening. Only that one spot in the center hall had answered her back. By morning, curiosity had shifted into obsession. She opened a box of documents her uncle's lawyer had handed her at the reading of the will. Deeds, tax records, payroll ledgers from the 90s. At the bottom was a worn leather folder stamped with Hale Industrial's old logo. Inside were building schematics, yellowed with age, edges curling like dried leaves. She spread them across the table, tracing her finger along the lines of walls and stairwells she had just walked through. Something didn't add up. The blueprints showed 5 storage wings, 4 staircases, and a basement level for boilers and utilities. But there was an entire section in the middle, a 6 0x8 0-foot rectangle labeled simply Storage B, with no access point marked. No stairs, no doorways. It was as if the space existed only on paper, a room no one could get into. Morgan flipped the pages, searching for updates, renovations, any sign of a sealed-off area. Nothing. She rubbed her forehead. Her uncle had never mentioned a hidden room. He'd never mentioned much at all about the plant after it closed. But she remembered the way he'd pause whenever they drove past it, his hand tightening on the wheel, his eyes unfocused, like he was seeing something behind the walls that she couldn't. She packed the blueprints, a flashlight, and a crowbar into a duffel bag and drove back to the factory. The rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot slick and shining. When she stepped inside, her boots echoed again, the sound of emptiness folding over itself. She walked straight to the center hall, to the cracked skylight and the gray pool of light. Kneeling, she pressed her palm flat to the concrete, cold, unyielding. She knocked twice, hollow. Her heart ticked faster. She traced the seams of the floor. There, along one edge, was a faint line, almost imperceptible, like a joint where the concrete had been poured separately. She straightened and pulled the blueprints from her bag, comparing lines, measurements. The rectangle of Storage B sat directly beneath her feet. Whatever was hidden down there, her uncle had gone to great lengths to bury it. Morgan stood, dust rising around her boots. She'd spent her whole life fixing what other people abandoned. Now, she had inherited something far larger than a broken engine, and for the first time, she wondered if she was ready for what she was about to find. The sun filtered weakly through the grimy skylights as Morgan returned the next morning, this time with heavier tools in the truck bed, a rotary hammer, a portable generator, and a crowbar nearly as old as the factory itself. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Who would she tell? The few people she still spoke to in Milltown either thought she was wasting her time or had already written off the factory as cursed. She rolled open the bay door, backed the truck in, and killed the engine. Dust motes danced in the air like ash, catching the morning light. Everything felt too still. She could hear her own breath. She set up the generator near the wall and pulled the hammer drill across the floor to that faint seam she'd marked the night before. She double-checked the blueprints again, even though she already knew she was standing directly above the undocumented room. The drill roared to life, echoing through the factory like a scream. She braced herself, pressed the bit to the concrete, and began. The first few inches were pure resistance-dense, aged cement. She worked methodically, carving out a clean section no larger than a dinner plate. By the time she broke through the last layer, her arms were shaking and her ears rang, even under the noise-canceling muffs. Then she heard it. A soft thunk as the bit punched through into nothing. Morgan froze. She eased back the drill, peered into the hole. Darkness. She grabbed her flashlight, angled it down. The beam fell away into what looked like a metal surface about 10 feet below. Not dirt, not stone, but steel. She dropped a bolt through the hole and counted silently. It clinked almost immediately. A steel ceiling, or a vault. She widened the hole. Slow, careful. She didn't know if the concrete beneath her was fully supported, and the last thing she wanted was to fall through. She cut a hole big enough to fit her hand and reached down, feeling the chill of metal under her fingertips. She pulled back and sat cross-legged on the cold floor, breathing hard. This wasn't just an old foundation or forgotten sub-basement. Someone had sealed this on purpose. It was too precise, too hidden. And the question that had been simmering since the first echo now burned in her chest. Why? She stood, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked slowly to the far end of the hall, where the old control office sat, its windows dusty and cracked. She climbed the rusted stairs and pushed the door open. The room smelled like mildew and old wiring. Filing cabinets stood like silent guards. She flipped through the drawers, page after page of maintenance logs and supply orders. Then she found a small metal key taped inside a dusty ledger, labeled simply Sub-01. Morgan stared at it. Her hand closed around the key. The floor hadn't just hidden something. It had locked it away. Morgan didn't go straight back to the hole. She couldn't. Not yet. Her hands trembled as she clutched the key, and some instinct she couldn't explain told her that once she opened whatever lay below, there'd be no turning back. Instead, she drifted through the factory like a ghost in her own life. Stopping at stations she vaguely remembered from childhood, the machine shop, with its rust-frozen lathes, the supervisor's booth where Uncle Ray used to sneak her sodas, the old break room with its shattered vending machine and a coffee pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since Clinton was president. She sat on a dented steel stool, her fingers trailing across the dusty table. A dozen memories flickered in and out, like static, on an old screen. Her uncle's laugh, the way he always carried 2 pens in his shirt pocket. The long afternoons he let her sit in the factory office, pretending to manage while he ran the floor. Back then, the factory had felt like a kingdom, and Ray was king. And then, just like that, the crown had disappeared. Ray stopped talking about the factory after it closed. She remembered asking once, maybe twice, why the machines had gone quiet. He just said, "Sometimes, Morgan, it's safer when things stay buried." At the time, she'd assumed he meant money, or taxes, or some kind of business mistake. But now she wondered if it had been something much bigger. The old control panels still lined the east wall, dust-coated but intact. She flipped the breaker switches out of habit. Nothing. Dead. Then she spotted the backup generator switchboard. It was locked, but the key in her hand, Sub-01, fit perfectly. Click. The factory buzzed alive with a low hum, deep and resonant, like the place was taking a long breath after years underwater. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, weak but steady. For the first time, Morgan saw the factory not as a ruin, but as something waiting, not dead, just dormant. She made her way back to the floor panel. With the lights on, everything looked sharper, more defined. The concrete edge she'd cut now gleamed faintly under the beams. She tested it with her boot. Still solid. She didn't feel fear. Not exactly, but something heavier anticipation braided with caution. Morgan uncoiled a length of climbing rope from her truck, looped it through an anchor bolt in the wall, and tied it off with a double figure 8. Then she widened the hole just enough to drop through. When she lowered the flashlight again, something caught the beam, a reflection. Smooth. Metallic. She took a breath, tied the rope around her waist, and began her descent. Boots scuffing the concrete edge, hands tight on the rope. 10 feet down, she touched metal. Brushed her fingers across a sealed hatch, industrial, thick, cold to the touch. And there, set dead center in the hatch, a keyhole, identical in shape to the one now shaking between her fingers. The key slid into the hatch like it had been waiting. Morgan hesitated, hand resting on the cold metal, her breath loud in the cramped space beneath the factory floor. Around her, the air was dense and metallic, heavy with the weight of years. She turned the key slowly. It clicked once, twice. Then a soft release of pressure hissed out as hidden latches disengaged. The hatch didn't swing open easily. She had to brace herself, muscles straining as she lifted against what felt like decades of stillness. It opened inch by inch until it rested against the steel floor, with a groan that echoed into blackness. She aimed her flashlight inside. A ladder descended into what looked like a chamber carved directly beneath the main floor, its walls not stone or concrete, but steel paneling, industrial, purpose-built, and not cheap. Morgan descended carefully, boots clanging against the metal rungs until she dropped to the floor below. The room stretched wide and low, maybe 20 feet deep and 50 across. Shelves lined the walls, Thick steel crates stacked 3 high, each one stamped with numbers and symbols she didn't recognize. She moved slowly, tracing her light along the nearest container. The locking mechanism was simple enough, a twist and lift latch. She undid it with a shaky hand and opened the lid. Inside, bricks. Not just any bricks, gold. Neatly stacked, gleaming dully in the weak flashlight beam. Her heart stopped. She reached in, lifted one. It was heavier than it looked. Solid, cold, real. She turned it over in her hand. Stamped into the surface were the words, UBS, Zurich, and a serial number. Her breath caught in her throat. She lowered the bar back into place and stumbled back, nearly tripping over a floor grate behind her. She sat for a moment on the cold steel, trying to breathe, trying to think. This wasn't just money. This was international. Laundered? Smuggled? Hidden during war? Her thoughts raced. She scanned the room again. Crates. Dozens of them. If they were all full, and she had no reason to believe they weren't, this wasn't a hidden stash. It was a vault. In the far corner, something else caught her eye. A smaller container, latched like the others but marked with red tape across the top. She opened it. Inside, ledgers, handwritten in looping cursive, some in English, others in what looked like German, maybe Czech. Transaction logs, names, account numbers. Next to them sat a sidearm, a vintage Beretta in perfect condition, and a weathered envelope with her uncle's name scribbled on it in familiar handwriting. She stared at it. Her name wasn't on the front, but somehow she knew it was meant for her. Morgan tucked the envelope into her jacket and looked around the room again, her pulse hammering in her ears. This wasn't forgotten. It had been hidden, carefully, intentionally, and her uncle had trusted her to find it. Morgan sat on the edge of the open hatch, the envelope burning a hole in her jacket pocket. Above her, the factory floor hummed faintly, the old fluorescent lights still flickering. Below her, millions, no, hundreds of millions in precious metal waited in silence. The magnitude of it was suffocating. She pulled out the envelope. The paper was brittle, the seal half cracked already from time. Inside was a single letter, written in her uncle's unmistakable slanted handwriting. No greeting, no date. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means you found what I never could walk away from. I never planned for you to carry this burden, but if anyone could make sense of it, it's you. I couldn't destroy it. I didn't know who to trust. I don't know what it all means anymore, but I hope you will. There was a second page, folded inside the first. Coordinates, foreign bank codes. And at the bottom, a list of initials and dates, going back to the late 72nds. Morgan folded the letter carefully, her pulse refusing to slow. This wasn't a leftover war vault. This was something bigger, more personal. Her uncle had been protecting it, or hiding it. Maybe both. She turned back to the ledgers. Each one was hand-numbered. The ink had bled in places, but the structure was clear. Dates, names, transaction amounts, item codes, not just gold, but weapons, equipment, wire transfers. Each entry meticulous. Some in her uncle's handwriting, others in a hand she didn't recognize. Some pages were stamped with red ink, complete. Others marked unclaimed. Morgan sat back on her heels, trying to piece it together. Had the factory been a front, a laundering hub, a storage site? Who were the buyers? Who were the sellers? And why had Ray never told her? Why leave it to her? She opened another crate. Inside, carefully wrapped in waxed cloth, was a row of silver-plated revolvers, each engraved. One still had dried oil on its grip. In another, she found sealed bags filled with old passports, many expired. Some faked, all from different countries. It was like stepping into a Cold War archive. Morgan stood in the center of the vault, the air dry and still. Every direction she turned, more secrets stared back at her. Her uncle hadn't just left behind a fortune. He had left behind a history. Suddenly, the weight of it all pressed hard on her chest. This wasn't hers. None of it felt like it belonged to her. And yet, it was. By law, by blood, by trust. But what could she do with it? Who could she even tell? She climbed back up the rope ladder. Slowly, the letter clenched in her fist. When she reached the surface, she didn't bother closing the hatch behind her. She sat cross-legged on the cold concrete, staring into the dusty light filtering through the skylight. She needed help, but not just any help. Someone who could keep this quiet. Someone who knew how to navigate a secret without letting it explode. Morgan's first instinct was to drive. Anywhere. Just get in the truck, slam the door, and let the road carry her until the weight in her chest cracked loose. But halfway down the gravel lot, she stopped. She couldn't run. Not with something this big. Not with something her uncle had trusted only her to find. Instead, she drove to the edge of town to a squat, two-story building tucked behind the old bank, its windows always half-shuttered, its doorbell long broken. The brass nameplate on the door, still Reed R. Maddox, attorney at law. Reed Maddox had been a friend of her uncle's for decades, a man of few words and fewer expressions. The kind of lawyer who never advertised, never answered to a firm, and somehow always knew more than he should. Morgan knocked. The door opened after 3 short seconds. Reed stood in the frame, gray-haired, rumpled, coffee in hand, and wearing the same tired cardigan she remembered from her childhood. He studied her for half a breath. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said. "You look like hell. Feels like it too." He stepped aside, and she followed him in. The office smelled of old leather and stronger coffee. Morgan didn't sit. She pulled the letter from her jacket, placed it on the desk like a confession. Reed read it slowly, without speaking. When he looked up, his expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had. "How much?" he asked. "I don't know." "A lot. Gold. Crates of it. Weapons. Passports. Ledgers going back decades." Reed leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "Then it wasn't a myth after all." Morgan blinked. "What do you mean?" He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a slim folder marked Personal Ray Hale. Inside were clippings, newsprint, a memo from a congressional investigation, most of it redacted. "Your uncle came to me in 1998, Reed said. Said there was something buried beneath the factory. Said he'd found documents, names, but he never told me what, exactly. Just that if something ever happened to him, someone needed to finish what he couldn't." "So why didn't he do anything?" Reed tapped the desk. "Because he was scared, and not for himself. For you. For this town." He said once, "Some things are buried because digging them up brings fire." Morgan ran a hand through her hair. "So what do I do now?" Reed didn't answer right away. He opened a small safe behind his desk, pulled out a USB drive, and slid it across to her. "What's this?" "Something Ray gave me. Said I'd know when to hand it over." Morgan stared at the drive like it might detonate. She didn't want more secrets. She wanted answers. Reed stood. "You've got something powerful down there. Maybe dangerous, maybe righteous. But if you're going to open this door any further..." He nodded at the flash drive. "You better be ready to finish walking through." Morgan closed her hand around it and felt the weight of a war she hadn't started, but just might be the one to end. Back at the factory, Morgan didn't go to the hatch. She went to the small office above the shop floor, the same room her uncle had used when he still ran the place. She dusted off the old Dell laptop he'd left behind, plugged in the USB drive from Reed, and waited. It took a moment for the ancient machine to churn to life. The screen flickered, then opened to a folder simply titled, "For M.H." Inside were documents, hundreds of them. Some were scans of military contracts. Others were handwritten notes by Ray himself. One file stood out. Contact log 8701. She opened it. Names, coordinates, wire transfer receipts, satellite images. One particular entry made her stomach twist. A wire from a Swiss account dated 1991, labeled "Payment received. Operation sealed. Surveillance terminated. This was bigger than she thought. Bigger than just hidden gold. This was a ghost operation. An entire Cold War-era asset transfer pipeline, shut down and covered up in silence. And now, every trace of it sat beneath her feet. And then came the knock. Morgan jumped. She hadn't given this address to anyone. She peeked through the dusty blinds. A black SUV. 2 men in dark suits. The kind of plain clothes that weren't casual. Government? Corporate? Worse? She didn't answer. But the taller man spoke through the door, calm and precise. Miss Hale, we represent a private consortium interested in the Hale property and its contents. We'd like to make you an offer. She opened the door halfway. You're going to have to be more specific. We're prepared to offer you $75 million, tax-free, immediate transfer. In exchange, you relinquish ownership of the factory, all its contents, and agree to a non-disclosure agreement. Lifelong. Morgan stared at him. The number was absurd. So was the fact they already knew what she'd found. You must think I'm stupid, she said flatly. No, ma'am, the man replied. We think you're smart enough to know what happens when people try to make public something meant to stay buried. It wasn't a threat. Not directly. But the chill in his voice cut through her spine. 75 million, she repeated. Why so generous? Because it's worth much more than that, the man said, smiling faintly. And you don't want the kind of attention that comes with proving it. They left a card and walked away without looking back. The SUV rolled out of the lot like it had never been there. Morgan shut the door, hand shaking, and leaned against the wall. She stared at the USB still glowing in the laptop, her heart a wildfire of panic and defiance. She could walk away right now, sell it, disappear, never worry about bills or busted engines or anything again. Her whole life she'd scraped by on grease and grit. But now she held a truth worth more than money. A secret someone wanted erased. And for the first time, Morgan Hale realized she might not be the one in danger. She might be the last line keeping the rest of it from being buried forever. The next morning, Morgan didn't wake to sunlight. She woke to silence, the kind that feels wrong. No bird song, no wind. Just a thick stillness pressing against her windows. She dressed quickly and drove to the factory, half expecting to find the gates padlocked or the hatch beneath the floor welded shut. But everything looked exactly as she'd left it. Too exactly. She entered the control office, checked the laptop. The USB drive was gone. Her heart seized. She tore through the drawers, checked the floor, the waste bin nothing. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows. But it was gone. Her mind raced. The men in the SUV, the offer, the warning. She grabbed the ledgers from the hidden vault, the physical proof, and stuffed them into a duffel bag. Then she did something she hadn't let herself consider until now. She made a call to a journalist. Not just any journalist. She called Ella Vargas, an old college friend who had gone from student paper crusader to a well-known investigative reporter for an independent outlet, the kind that didn't flinch when the story had teeth. Morgan didn't give details over the phone. Just said, I've got something. You'll want to see it. Ella arrived that night. She was skeptical at first. But when Morgan opened the vault and Ella saw the gold, the crates, the weapons, the ledgers, her breath caught. Jesus. Morgan, what is this? I don't know. But someone wants it buried again. And I don't think I can stop them alone. They worked through the night, scanning documents, photographing everything. Ella made secure backups. Morgan kept watch at the door. It felt like something out of a spy film. Only the stakes were terrifyingly real. By sunrise, Ella looked up from the last ledger. Her voice was low. This is international. Government contracts, shadow accounts, weapons transfers tied to defense agencies that supposedly don't exist anymore. If you go public with this, they'll come for me. Morgan finished. Ella hesitated. You don't have to do this. We can make copies. Hide the originals. Leak it through sources. Morgan shook her head. That's not what Ray wanted. He left it to me. Not to sell, Not to bury. To finish what he couldn't. Ella studied her for a long moment. Then you better be ready for what comes next. I already made my choice, Morgan said. Her voice didn't waver. I'm not walking away. Not when the truth's been buried under our feet for decades. The next day, the story began to break carefully, anonymously. A few breadcrumbs at a time. The SUV returned. This time, they didn't knock. Just circled the block and left. Morgan didn't flinch. She wasn't just fixing the past anymore. She was exposing it. And if it meant risking everything, her name, her safety, the legacy of a man who died holding on to something too heavy to carry, then so be it. Because some things aren't meant to stay buried. And she was done being silent. 3 weeks after the first article dropped, the factory didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a heartbeat. Slow, steady, undeniable. The media frenzy came and went in waves. Independent outlets picked it up first. Whispers of a forgotten gold vault beneath a North Carolina machine plant. Then came the fact-checkers, the skeptics, the deniers. But every time the noise threatened to drown the truth, Morgan released another piece of evidence, scanned ledgers, coordinates, historical receipts, photos of crates, stamped with numbers that matched long-forgotten military shipments. The world started paying attention, and so did the ones who never wanted it seen. There were veiled threats, letters without return addresses, dark SUVs idling too long at the end of her street, a drone that hovered outside her apartment for nearly an hour. But Morgan stood her ground. She'd spent her life working with cracked engines, stripped bolts, and customers who thought she wasn't strong enough to tighten their lug nuts. She knew pressure. She knew fear. She knew how to keep moving even when her hands shook. And now, she had something she'd never had before. Purpose. She turned the factory into something new. Not a museum, not a media circus, but a quiet, secure archive. With Ella's help, and later, legal backing from whistleblower protection groups, she created a foundation, the Hale Trust, dedicated to investigating, preserving, and exposing hidden histories buried under bureaucracy and fear. She hired veterans, mechanics, retired engineers, women who'd never had a fair shot, young apprentices who didn't know a thing about gold, but could spot an encrypted ledger like second nature. They didn't come for the money. They came because something about Morgan made people believe in the work, not in the gold or the scandal, in the truth. Morgan never touched $1 of the stash. Every brick, every artifact, was documented, photographed, and locked in transparent storage under heavy surveillance. She wanted the world to know she wasn't hiding anything, that the legacy wasn't just wealth, it was proof. One afternoon, as the last of the storm headlines faded, Reed Maddox stopped by the factory. Same cardigan, same unreadable expression. He looked at the sealed hatch in the floor and nodded once. "You did it," he said softly. Morgan looked around at the humming workspace, the archival boxes stacked with care, the team cleaning relics and translating old notes. "No," she said. "We did," Reed smiled. "Your uncle would have been proud." Morgan glanced toward the high wall where she'd hung the framed blueprint of the factory. Just above it, a brass plaque read, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you refuse to bury." She'd started this journey as a mechanic, someone who fixed broken things and sent them on their way. Now, she was a builder of something far more lasting. And beneath the surface of it all, where silence once reigned, the truth was finally speaking. Loud, clear, and impossible to shut away again.